Winter 1950. Somewhere on the ridgelines above the Chosin Reservoir, the thermometer sat near 30 below zero, and for a lot of American riflemen, that number mattered more than anything printed in a field manual. Rifle oil turned to paste in that kind of cold. Actions that worked fine in Fort Benning froze solid in North Korea. Veterans of that campaign would spend the rest of their lives describing the moment a jammed M1 Garand stopped being a rifle and became a very expensive club, and the moment they reached for whatever was still working, a knife, a shovel, a fist wrapped in brass, because the war did not pause while a man cleared his action in the dark. That is where this list lives. Not an official inventory, but in the gap between what the Army issued and what the terrain, the cold, and the enemy actually demanded. Korea gets remembered today as a strange, in-between war, fought with World War II leftovers against an enemy that outnumbered American units badly enough to force constant improvisation on both sides of the wire. It doesn't get the cultural way of the war before it or the one after it, and a lot of what soldiers actually carried into those hills never made it past the supply sergeant's paperwork. At number 13, an improvised weapon built from a fuel drum that command considered too indiscriminate to allow anywhere near a friendly perimeter. And at number 1, a story so well documented, so thoroughly decorated, that the Army had no choice but to put metal on it, even while the weapon at the center of it violated exactly what doctrine said a rifleman should be doing at that moment. Before we get into it, subscribe, because this channel tracks down the equipment that never made it into the official history of America's wars. The stuff soldiers built with their own hands, because the supply chain couldn't keep up with what the fighting actually required. Let's count them down. Number 25. Start with the simplest tool in any infantryman's kit, the pickaxe and the mattock, standard issue for digging fighting positions into Korea's rocky, half-frozen hillsides. Both had a pointed steel head that took an edge fast on a field grinder. In the static trench warfare that defined the last 2 years of the war, positions like Pork Chop Hill and Outpost Harry saw fighting collapse into bunkers and connecting trenches barely wider than a man's shoulders. In that kind of space, a rifle with a fixed bayonet was often too long to swing. A sharpened pickaxe wasn't. It had reach, weight, and it was already sitting in every entrenching kit in the company, which made it nearly impossible for any inspection to flag as a modification. Number 24. The Chinese and North Korean armies issued their infantry stick grenades, roughly modeled on the old German potato masher pattern, with a wooden throwing handle and a fragmentation or concussion head. UN troops picked these up constantly, from overrun positions, from prisoners from the dead, and more than a few American and South Korean soldiers carried them back into the line, rather than turning them in. A stick grenade thrown back into the trench it came from carried a specific kind of message, and more than a few veterans later admitted they preferred the extra throwing distance the wooden handle gave them over the standard Mk2 Pineapple. Number 23. Shotguns had a long, unofficial tradition in the American military, going back to the trenches of the First World War, and that tradition didn't disappear in Korea. Leftover Winchester Model 97 and Ithaca 37 trench guns, some still carrying World War II unit markings, occasionally turn-up cut down to 16 or 18 inches for close-quarters bunker clearing, where a wide spread of buckshot did more work in a 3-second engagement than a single rifle round ever could. These weapons rarely appeared on any formal property book for the units that used them, because officially, shotguns had been phased toward rear area guard duty. Unofficially, they kept showing up wherever bunkers needed clearing. Number 22. Brass knuckles were never issued equipment, and soldiers made their own anyway, the same way men had in 2 previous wars. A soldier with access to a machine shop, or even just a vise and file, could cast a rough set from scrap brass, spent shell casings, or salvage fittings, shaping a mold around his own fist. So the fit was exact, in the confusion of a trench raid, where a man could round a corner and find himself face-to-face with an enemy soldier at arm's length. A weighted brass fist ended that encounter faster than drawing a sidearm ever could. Number 21. The trench club, a length of hardwood with something heavy fixed to the striking end, nails, a section of pipe, a chunk of scrap metal, had been standard improvised equipment in the trenches of 1918. 32 years later, the terrain of Central Korea put American infantry back into something close to that same static in trench warfare, and the club came back with it. It required no ammunition, made almost no sound, and worked exactly as well in a bunker in 1952 as it had in a French trench in 1918. Soldiers built them out of whatever was on hand, tent stakes, pick handles, chunks of firewood, and nobody wrote them up because a stick with a nail in it doesn't look like a weapon on a supply manifest. Number 20. Silence mattered more on a Korean trench raid than almost anywhere else in the war, because the front lines by 1951 sat close enough that a single shout could bring mortar fire down on both sides within a minute. Patrol teams assigned to snatch a prisoner for intelligence purposes sometimes carried improvised garrotes, a length of wire or parachute cord with wooden toggles lashed to each end, for silencing a sentry without firing a shot. It wasn't formally taught in most training pipelines. It was passed soldier to soldier, the same way it had been in the trenches of the First World War, because some skills survived by word of mouth long after the war that produced them is over. Number 19. This is where the record is unusually clear, because two of the men who used a sharpened entrenching tool in close combat received the Medal of Honor for it. In June 1951, 2nd Lieutenant Benjamin Wilson of the 5th Cavalry Regiment fought his way back up a hill near Watchin after being wounded and evacuated, and when the fighting turned hand to hand and his rifle was torn from his grip, he killed several enemy soldiers with his entrenching tool before being wounded again. Around the same period, Corporal Anthony Keohanahano of the 17th Infantry Regiment used his entrenching tool to kill enemy soldiers at close range while covering his platoon's withdrawal, an action for which he was also later awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The standard folding shovel weighed a little over 2 pounds. Sharpened along one edge on a field grinder, it became the difference between a doctrine that assumed you'd always have a working rifle and a battlefield that frequently made sure you didn't. Number 18. The M3 trench knife, a World War II holdover with a nearly 7-inch blade and a simple stacked leather grip, remained standard issue for a lot of infantry units heading into Korea. Some soldiers reworked them anyway, thinning the grip, shortened the blade by 1 inch or 2 on a bench grinder, wrapping the handle in tape for a better hold with frozen or sweat-soaked hands. The modifications were small, almost cosmetic to an inspector's eye, but they mattered to a man carrying the blade into a bunker where his hand might be the only thing telling him what a knife actually was. Number 17. American troops developed a genuine respect, bordering on obsession, for a weapon they weren't issued. The Soviet-designed PPSH-41, a drum-fed submachine gun, the Chinese produced under license as a Type 50, earned the nickname burp gun for the buzzing sound of its high cyclic rate, somewhere near 900 rounds a minute. Marines and soldiers who fought through the Chosin Reservoir campaign came away convinced it outclassed anything comparable in the American inventory at close range, and more than a few pulled capture examples off dead or captured enemy soldiers and carried them for the rest of their tour, feeding them from whatever 7.62 by 25 ammunition they could scavenge, trade for, or pull off the next body. Some infantry commanders said later they considered the burp gun the single best close-range weapon either side fielded in the entire war, which made the fact that it never appeared on any American property book feel almost beside the point. Number 16. Where the PPSH-41 was common, its cousin the PPS-43 was rarer, and, according to several accounts from veterans of fighting, even more prized for its lighter weight and folding stock, which made it easier to carry and conceal than the drum-fed burp gun. A soldier walking patrol with a PPS-43 slung under a parka was carrying a weapon with no official supply chain behind it whatsoever, no spare parts, no authorized ammunition allocation, nothing but what he could scrounge, trade, or take. Number 15. The Colt M1911A1 was standard issue for officers, machine gun crews, and rear echelon personnel, and its hammer spur had a habit of catching on gear in a cramped bunker or trench line. Armorers in some units filed the spur down on request, a modification that technically violated the Army's technical manual for the weapons fire control group, but which made the pistol faster and safer draw from a shoulder holster buried under a parka, gloves, and however many layers a man needed to survive a Korean winter night. Number 14, and this is where the list turns towards something the Army treated far more seriously than a sharpened shovel or a filed hammer spur. In the summer of 1950, during the opening weeks of the war, American and South Korean infantry found themselves facing North Korean T 34 tanks, with almost nothing in their inventory capable of stopping them. The available bazookas, the 2.36-inch rocket launchers left over from World War II, frequently failed to penetrate the T-34's frontal armor. Desperate infantry improvised the same solution soldiers had reached for since the Spanish Civil War. The Molotov cocktail, a bottle of gasoline with a burning rag stuffed in the neck, thrown at engine grills and vision slits at a range close enough to get a man killed doing it. It worked often enough to become part of the early war's desperate folklore, and it worked precisely because it required nothing the Army had to approve. Number 13. This is the one the record treats with real caution, because it's its closest to what the laws of war actually prohibit. In the static defensive lines of 1951 through 1953, some forward units rigged 55-gallon fuel drums with explosive charges and ignition systems into improvised flame traps, sometimes called fougasse, a technique with roots going back to 18th century siege warfare and revived heavily by both sides in World War II. Positioned to cover approaches to a bunker line, a fougasse threw a wall of fire across a fixed kill zone the instant a tripwire was pulled or a command detonation was triggered. It was, on paper, a defensive weapon aimed at a specific patch of ground rather than a person, but the fireball it produced was indiscriminate by nature, and that is exactly why senior commanders pushed back against the practice whenever they found it. A tripwire drum of burning fuel does not distinguish between the enemy's soldier it was built for and whoever else wanders into that same patch of ground. Friendly patrol, forward observer, or otherwise. Number 12. The M2 carbine, the fully automatic version of the standard M1 carbine, developed a reputation in Korea's cold that its designers never anticipated. Its .30 carbine round lost stopping power in sub-zero temperatures, and its action, like nearly everything else in the theater, was prone to freezing solid if lubricated the way training manuals back in the States recommended. Armorers and troops in the field learned to strip weapons down to bare metal or use minimal, cold-weather-rated oil, a fix that ran directly against standard maintenance doctrine, but one that kept the difference between a working weapon and a jammed one. Number 11. During the retreat from the chosen reservoir, in temperatures that regularly dropped below -20, the M1 Garand semi-automatic action jammed with enough frequency that veteran accounts of the campaign returned to it again and again decades later, almost as a shared reference point. Oil turned to something closer to wax. Metal contracted just enough to bind. A rifle that had performed perfectly at Fort Benning became, in that cold, a single-shot weapon at best and a dead weight at worst, and there was no field manual that told a 19-year-old private what to do about it in the middle of a night assault. Marines and soldiers who found their Garands frozen solid in the middle of a Chinese human wave attack fell back on bayonets, entrenching tools, and fists, which is a large part why so many of the era's closest, most brutal fighting stories, the ones that read almost like something out of an earlier century, come out of exactly that campaign. Number 10, and this is where things get heavier. The Thompson submachine gun, the M1928A1 and M1A1 variants, was officially considered obsolete by the start of the Korean War, largely replaced in doctrine by the M2 carbine and the M3 grease gun. Plenty of infantrymen disagreed with that judgment once they got into close terrain. Units pulled Thompsons out of storage depots and carried them anyway, drawn to the heavier .45 ACP rounds, stopping power at the short ranges that defined trench raids and bunker assaults. Supply sergeants who kept Thompsons on the books for units that were supposed to have turned them and became a quiet, persistent feature of the war's logistics. Number 9. Standard M1 rifle and carbine bayonets occasionally got a second life as fighting knives, ground down from a full-length blade into something shorter and easy to carry loose in a pocket or boot rather than fixed to a rifle. A modified bayonet had a full tang and a reinforced spine that most improvised trench knives couldn't match, which made it, in the eyes of more than a few tunnel-clearing and bunker-clearing soldiers, one of the sturdier close combat tools available, official or not. Number 8. Before the Army fielded the M1951 fragmentation vest in any real numbers, which didn't reach most infantry units until well into 1952, soldiers on the line improvised their own body protection out of whatever was available. Sandbags stacked inside a foxhole or bunker wall did double duty as fragmentation shielding, and men learned quickly which angles of the position actually needed the extra layer and which didn't. Some soldiers lined inside of their field jackets with scrap steel plate scavenged from destroyed vehicles or downed aircraft, a crude solution that added significant weight for uncertain protection. It slowed a man down on patrol and did nothing against a direct hit, but against the shrapnel from a near miss, which accounted for most of the war's artillery casualties. It felt like something worth the extra pounds to a soldier sitting through a barrage with no other armor at all. Number 7. The Browning automatic rifle. The squad standard base of fire, weighed close to 20 pounds with its bipod and butt plate attached, built for sustained fire from a fixed position rather than mobility. In trench raids and night patrols, where speed and a low profile mattered more than sustained output, some bar gunners stripped the bipod and swapped the standard butt plate for a lighter one, shedding several pounds in exchange for a weapon that moved faster through a trench line even if it lost some of its stability on longer bursts. Number 6. Not every unauthorized weapon in Korea was something a soldier bolted together in a motor pool. Sniping in the Korean War operated with far less consistency and formal doctrine than it would in later conflicts, and in the gaps left by that inconsistent program, a number of designated marksmen carried personally owned or non-issue scope rifles, Winchester Model 70s, sporterized 1903 Springfields, whatever man could get sent from home or trade a South Korean hunter out of, rather than whatever limited sniper-configured M1 DS their unit actually had on hand. It wasn't officially sanctioned, and it left those soldiers responsible for ammunition and spare parts that the Army supply system had no interest in tracking, but it put a working precision rifle in a shooter's hands when the official pipeline couldn't. Number 5, and this is where regulation and practice pulled hardest against each other. General orders on captured enemy ordnance were unambiguous. Weapons like the PPSH-41 were supposed to be surrendered through intelligence channels for examination, cataloged, and in most cases sent to the rear, not carried into the next firefight. In practice, entire fire teams in some units quietly re-equipped themselves with captured burp guns in place of their issued carbines. It wasn't always a junior, enlisted men driving it. Company-level officers who tolerated, or in some documented cases actively encouraged, the practice put themselves in violation of the same property accountability rules their men were breaking, because an officer who looks the other way on an unauthorized weapon isn't neutral. He's complicit. The Uniform Code of Military Justice had only just gone into effect in the spring of 1951, and under it, both the officer and the enlisted man carrying an unlogged captured weapon were technically exposed to charges under Article 108 for the unauthorized disposition of government property they were supposed to be turning in rather than keeping for themselves. Number 4. Sandbag-reinforced bunkers on both sides of the front line were vulnerable at one specific point, the firing aperture, and soldiers on wiring and demolition details fabricated improvised Bangalore torpedo sections, lengths of pipe packed with explosive charge, to breach barbed wire entanglements ahead of an assault rather than relying solely on standard-issue engineer stores, which frequently ran short at the point in an operation where they were needed most. It was dangerous, unreliable work built from whatever pipe and charge a unit could scrounge, and it existed almost entirely because the supply chain for proper breaching equipment couldn't keep pace with how often a unit actually needed to breach. Number 3. Late in the war, as the front lines calcified into something close to the trench deadlock of 1918, patrol leaders facing static, heavily wired enemy positions sometimes assembled improvised fragmentation charges from captured enemy demolition blocks and scrap metal, rigged as command-detonated devices covering approach routes to friendly positions. It was the kind of practice that put units' own engineers on edge, because a charge built without standardized components and standardized safety margins is a charge that can fail in either direction, and more than one after-action account from the period notes engineer officers quietly dismantling these devices during routine bunker inspections rather than writing anyone up for building them. Number 2. The trench knife tradition that ran through both world wars didn't end with the M3. Soldiers ground personal fighting knives from broken bayonets, truck leaf springs, and files, the same raw materials armorers had been improvising with for 3 decades, shaping blades to fit a single man's hand and a single man's idea of what a close-quarters weapon should do. None of them showed up on a property book. Most of them went home in a footlocker, wrapped in a spare shirt, and stayed there for decades before a grandchild found them and had no idea what they were looking at. Number 1. On the morning of September 17, 1951, during the brutal fight for a position that would become known as Heartbreak Ridge, Private First Class Herbert Pillow of the 23rd Infantry Regiment stayed behind to cover his platoon's withdrawal after his position was overrun. When his ammunition ran out, he fought on with his trench knife in his fists, buy his platoon enough time to fall back and retake the position roughly 30 minutes later. When they got back to his position, they found he had held the line alone against overwhelming numbers at the cost of his own life. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Hawaiian to receive it. There was nothing unauthorized about the knife Pillow carried. It was standard issue, but there was everything unauthorized about Doctrine itself in that moment. No training manual tells a soldier to hold a position alone with a blade after his ammunition is gone. He did it anyway, and the Army had no regulation on the books that could explain why. Only a medal, OUTRO 25 weapons, some sharpened on a field grinder, some pulled off a dead enemy soldier, some nothing more than a shovel that had already been sitting in every soldier's kit since basic training. None of them show up in the way most people picture Korean War, which usually starts and ends with the M1 Garand, the Browning machine gun, and maybe a Sabre jet overhead. But the sharpened E-tools, the captured Burke guns, the trench clubs that came back from a war 3 decades earlier because the terrain demanded the same solutions, those are the details that get lost between the official after-action reports and the movies made decades later. If your grandfather or great-uncle served in Korea, and there's a story in your family about something he carried that never made it into the official record, I want to hear in the comments. What was in his footlocker when he came home? What did he keep that he never fully explained? And what did he tell you about it? If he told you anything at all. Korea has a reputation as America's forgotten war, and that reputation extends all the way down to the equipment. Somewhere in a garage in Ohio, a closet in Tucson, a shoebox nobody's opened since the funeral. Some of these weapons are probably still sitting, waiting for someone to ask what they are. If you want to go deeper on how American troops adapted to cold itself, not just the weapons, but the frostbite, the frozen rations, the gear that failed at 30 below, I made a video on exactly that. You can check it out by clicking right here.